It started with a scream. A piercing, desperate wail that shattered the quiet autumn air of Fairview. By the time neighbors rushed outside, Claire Whitmore was already running toward the woods, her voice hoarse as she called her son's name. Daniel! Daniel! Fairview was the kind of town where nothing ever happened. Nestled against the dense, shadowy expanse of Fairview Woods, it was a place of old traditions, familiar faces, and an unshakable sense of safety. But that night, safety became an illusion. 8-year-old Daniel Whitmore had vanished without a trace. Neighbors poured into the streets. Porch lights flickered on one by one, illuminating worried faces. Within minutes, the backyard of the Whitmore family's rustic cabin was filled with frantic voices. Daniel had been there just moments before, his bicycle lay abandoned near the tree line, one wheel still spinning. Claire dropped to her knees, clutching the handlebars. No footprints. No trail. Just an overwhelming silence. Sheriff Hank Glover arrived within the hour, his aging patrol car kicking up gravel as he pulled in. A seasoned officer, he had seen his share of missing persons cases, but something about this one felt different. The air was thick with unease. He turned to Claire, whose face was pale with terror. "Mrs. Whitmore, tell me exactly what happened." Her voice trembled. "He was playing outside. I went in to get him a jacket. When I came back, he was gone." Glover's gaze shifted toward the woods. "Did Daniel ever wander in there?" She shook her head vehemently. "Never. He was scared of it." The search began immediately. Flashlights flickered between the trees as deputies combed through the underbrush. Neighbors called Daniel's name into the darkness. But the woods swallowed every sound, offering no clues in return. And then the realization set in: Daniel Whitmore had not simply wandered off. He had disappeared. The morning sun cast long shadows over Fairview as the search intensified. Deputies expanded their grid, helicopters hovered above, and tracking dogs were brought in. The town had seen lost hikers before, but this felt different. The woods had given up no footprints, no clothing, no struggle, only a creeping sense of something unnatural. By the third day, Sheriff Glover faced the question no one wanted to ask. What if he's not in the woods at all? The unsettling possibility shifted the investigation's focus. FBI agents arrived, setting up headquarters in the town hall. They questioned Claire and her husband, Greg, probing every detail. Did Daniel have any enemies? Did he ever mention talking to strangers? Has anything unusual happened in the past few weeks? Claire's answers were frantic but firm. No. No. Nothing. But Greg was different. His responses were clipped. He avoided eye contact. And then came the revelation that changed everything. Greg had withdrawn over $20,000 in cash just weeks before Daniel's disappearance. What was the money for, Mr. Whitmore, an agent asked. Greg's jaw tightened. Home repairs. But there were no work orders. No contractors scheduled. Nothing. And then a new lead surfaced. A neighbor, Mrs. Holloway, recalled seeing a black SUV parked outside the Whitmore home the night before Daniel vanished. I didn't think much of it, she admitted. But now, the FBI pulled surveillance footage from a nearby gas station. There, clear as day, was Greg Whitmore, talking to an unidentified man in a suit, exchanging something that looked an awful lot like documents. When confronted, Greg's composure cracked. This has nothing to do with Daniel, he insisted. You're wasting time. But no one believed him. Fairview changed overnight. Parents clutched their children's hands a little tighter. Strangers were eyed with suspicion. Rumors spread like wildfire. Some believed Daniel had been taken by someone passing through. Others whispered about something darker, that maybe the woods themselves had swallowed him whole. By the end of the first week, fear had replaced hope. And then, the first real clue appeared. A fisherman discovered a small blue backpack submerged in a creek at the edge of the forest. Inside were Daniel's schoolbooks, a half-eaten granola bar, and one deeply disturbing item, a burner phone. It had only one message. It's done. The FBI traced the phone's purchase to a store in a neighboring town. Security footage revealed the buyer, Greg Whitmore. Greg was brought in for questioning, his hands trembling. Where is he, Greg? An agent demanded. We have enough to put you away. Talk now, and maybe we can find your son alive. Greg's gaze darted to the floor. I swear, I didn't mean for this to happen. Greg broke. The pressure, the weight of the secret he had carried, crushed him. he admitted that Daniel's disappearance had not been random. He had been targeted. Greg had a past he had tried desperately to bury. Dishonorably discharged from the military under unclear circumstances, he had once been involved in covert operations overseas. But when he walked away from that life, he owed people. Dangerous people. They had come for payment. And when Greg failed to deliver, they took Daniel as leverage. The burner phone had been a warning. Authorities scrambled, cross-referencing Greg's contacts. Through a series of frantic searches, they pinpointed a remote cabin deep in the woods. If Daniel was alive, that's where he would be. A SWAT team moved in under the cover of darkness. Armed with night vision scopes and silencers, they approached the isolated cabin. Every second counted. Inside, Daniel sat in a dimly lit room, his small frame curled up on a tattered mattress. His captors, 2 ex-military operatives, paced anxiously. They had planned to use him as a bargaining chip, but with Greg's arrest, they were running out of options. A branch snapped outside. Then came the breach. Flashbangs shattered the silence. Doors were kicked open. The kidnappers barely had time to react before they were subdued. An officer rushed to Daniel. "Are you Daniel Whitmore?" Tearful, wide-eyed, the boy nodded. "I just want to go home." The town of Fairview erupted in relief. Daniel was home. His mother clutched him so tightly it seemed as if she would never let go. But the scars of his ordeal ran deep. Nightmares plagued him. The shadows of the woods seemed darker. The world, once safe, felt different. Greg, once the town's quiet family man, was no longer a mystery. His secrets had cost him everything. He was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison for conspiracy and endangerment. The men who had taken Daniel faced their own reckoning. And yet, one question remained: had all the culprits really been caught? Even years later, Daniel, now grown, would write about that time, piecing together the shadows of his past. But some mysteries never fade. And deep in the woods of Fairview, the whispers never ceased. Years passed, and Daniel Whitmore grew into a man haunted by the past. His memoir, Into the Woods, My Survival, became a national bestseller, detailing his terrifying abduction and the twisted secrets that had led to it. People praised his resilience, his strength, but Daniel knew the story wasn't over. Because something still didn't make sense. The night he was rescued, Daniel had seen something he never told anyone. A third man. While the SWAT team arrested his 2 captors, Daniel had caught a glimpse of someone standing outside the cabin, watching from the trees. A shadowy figure who had slipped away the moment the first gunshot rang out. No one had ever found him. And then, on the night of his book's release, a package arrived at Daniel's doorstep. No return address. Just a plain envelope inside. With a single Polaroid. A photograph of Daniel as a child. Standing in the woods. And behind him, a dark figure, just out of focus. Scrawled on the back, in shaky handwriting. "We were never after your father." Daniel's hands trembled as he stared at the message. His breath turned shallow. Because if they weren't after Greg, then who were they really after? And why did they still care, all these years later? As the shadows outside his window stretched long into the night, Daniel realized something chilling. His story wasn't over. It was just beginning. Daniel Whitmore never wanted to go back to Fairview. For years, he had stayed away, building a new life in the city, far from the memories that haunted his childhood. But after receiving the Polaroid, the eerie image of himself as a boy, the shadowy figure lurking behind him, and the cryptic message on the back, he knew he had no choice. The past wasn't done with him. So, on a cold November morning, Daniel packed a small bag, threw his memoir into the passenger seat, and began the long drive home. As the highway signs blurred past, the questions gnawed at him. Who were they really after? Why send the photo now? And, worst of all, was he ever truly safe? Fairview looked the same. The old diner on Main Street still had its flickering neon sign. The town hall still stood like a relic of another time, its clock tower frozen at 4:17, the moment lightning had struck it during a storm 2 decades ago. And the woods still loomed, dark and endless, pressing against the town like an unspoken threat. Daniel parked outside his childhood home, now abandoned. The front porch creaked under his weight as he stepped up, running a hand along the wooden railing. The door was locked, but he still had the key. Inside, the air was stale, thick with dust and silence. The furniture was covered in white sheets, the ghost of a life long gone. But one thing hadn't changed, the feeling. That suffocating, watching presence. As if something unseen lingered in the corners, waiting. Daniel exhaled sharply, pushing the feeling away. He wasn't here to dwell. He was here for answers. And he knew exactly where to start. Mrs. Holloway still lived 2 houses down. She was older now, frilier, but when she opened the door and saw Daniel standing there, her eyes widened in recognition. "Daniel Whitmore," she breathed. "I never thought I'd see you again." "I need to talk," he said. "About that night." She hesitated, glancing over her shoulder, as if afraid someone might be listening. Then, with a nod, she stepped aside. Over a cup of tea that neither of them touched, Daniel pressed her for details. "You said you saw a black SUV that night." She nodded. "Parked right outside your house, late. 2 men inside, but I only got a good look at one of them." She hesitated. "He wasn't from around here. Tall, sharp features. Military type." Daniel tensed. "My father was involved with dangerous people," he admitted. "I think they were after him." But, he pulled the Polaroid from his pocket and slid it across the table. "I got this in the mail a few days ago." Mrs. Holloway's hands trembled as she picked it up. She stared at it for a long moment, then looked at Daniel with something almost like fear. "You were never alone that night." His breath caught. "What?" "I never told the police. But when the search parties were out there, I saw something. A light. Deep in the woods. And a figure standing just at the edge, watching." "Watching what?" Daniel asked, his pulse quickening. "Watching us." That night, Daniel couldn't sleep. The old house groaned around him, every creak sending a shiver down his spine. The Polaroid sat on the nightstand, the image burning into his mind. "We were never after your father." "Then who?" As the clock struck midnight, he made a decision. He had to go back to the cabin. The place where he had been held. The place where the nightmare had started. The woods had not been kind to him as a child. But as an adult, they felt worse. The deeper he went, the more the trees seemed to close in, branches like grasping fingers in the moonlight. Then, finally, he saw it. The cabin. It was different now. Abandoned. Half collapsed from years of neglect. But the moment he stepped inside, the memories hit him like a wave. The cold. The fear. The sound of footsteps outside the door at night. He moved cautiously, his flashlight sweeping over broken furniture and shattered glass. And then, a noise. A creak. Daniel spun around, heart pounding. Silence. Just the wind. But when he turned back, something caught his eye. A single, untouched envelope. Sitting in the middle of the floor. His hands shook as he picked it up, flipped it over. There was no stamp, no return address. Just his name. Slowly, he opened it. Inside was a newspaper clipping. Boy found in Fairview Woods after disappearance. His own face stared back at him. But it wasn't the article that sent ice down his spine. It was the red-inked message scrawled beneath it. "You were never supposed to leave." Daniel stumbled back, his mind racing. Who had left this? Who still cared, after all these years? A sound outside. Leaves crunching. Someone was here. He killed his flashlight, pressing himself against the wall, heart hammering. Through the broken window, he saw a figure standing just at the edge of the trees. Not moving. Not speaking. Just watching. His throat went dry. Had it been them all along? Had they followed him from the moment he arrived? With a shaking breath, Daniel reached for his phone, snapped a quick picture through the glass. Then he bolted, out the door, through the woods, running like he had all those years ago. By the time he reached his car, he could barely breathe. He fumbled with his phone, pulling up the photo. The figure was there. But its face. It wasn't clear. It wasn't human. And behind it, deep in the trees, a faint, glowing light. Daniel left Fairview that night. Drove until the town disappeared in his rearview mirror. But the nightmares followed. And the more he thought about it, the more one horrifying possibility took root in his mind. What if the people who had taken him all those years ago weren't the real threat? What if they had been running from something too? And what if, after all these years, that something was still waiting for him to come back? Because as Daniel drifted into uneasy sleep, his phone buzzed once. A new message. No number. No sender. Just 2 words. Come home. Daniel's fingers trembled as he stared at the screen. Come home. 2 words. No number. No explanation. His stomach twisted. Who sent this? His home was long gone. His parents, one in prison, one broken by the past. Then his phone buzzed again. An image. A live photo. He tapped it. The screen flickered, showing the outside of his childhood home. Right now. The porch light was on. Someone was there. Daniel slammed on the brakes. Pulled over on the deserted highway. His breathing was ragged. This wasn't possible. He had left Fairview hours ago. His house had been abandoned for years. Whoever sent this wasn't just watching. They wanted him to know. He hesitated, then called the police. A static-filled ring. Then a voice. Fairview Sheriff's Office. Relief flooded him. I need an officer at 12, Willow Lane, he stammered. Someone's there. They sent me a photo. Silence. Then, sir, there is number 12 Willow Lane. Daniel's blood ran cold. What? No such address exists in Fairview. His voice dropped. That's my childhood home. A long pause. Then, a low response. Sir, that house burned down 20 years ago. Daniel's mind spun. No. He was just there. He stood on that porch. Used his key to unlock the door. Had he imagined it? Or has someone rebuilt it? He scrolled back to the live photo. Looked closer. Then he saw it. A shadow in the window. A figure standing inside the house. Watching. Waiting. His stomach lurched. He knew what he had to do. He had to go back. Daniel pulled into Fairview just after midnight. The town was dead. No street lights. No people. Just the sound of wind pushing through the trees. He turned onto Willow Lane. His heart stopped. The house was gone. Just an empty lot. Overgrown grass. No porch. No light. Nothing. But his phone still showed the house standing. Still showed the shadow in the window. And then, the front door in the image creaked open. Daniel's body went rigid. Then, his phone buzzed one last time. A new text. One word. Run. But before he could move, a whisper cut through the silence. Right behind him. Welcome home, Daniel. The voice sent a cold shiver down Daniel's spine. He spun around, breath shallow, heart slamming against his ribs. Nothing. Just the empty lot. The wind is stirring the trees. Had he imagined it? No. Someone was here. Then, his phone buzzed again. A new text. You shouldn't have come back. Daniel's grip tightened on his phone. Enough was enough. He wasn't going to run. He wasn't going to be afraid anymore. Whoever had been haunting him for years, whoever had taken him as a child, was still watching. And this time, he was going to get answers. Daniel took a step forward, scanning the empty lot. His childhood home had once stood here. A modest cabin on the edge of town, right before the woods. But it had burned down. The sheriff had confirmed it. The neighbors had sworn it was gone. And yet, the live photo on his phone showed the house standing. A warm porch light glowing. A shadow in the window. He clenched his jaw. Was someone messing with him? His mind raced. Deep down, a thought gnawed at him. What if, somehow, he had remembered things wrong? What if the truth about that night wasn't what he had believed for years? A rustling sound. Daniel's head snapped toward the tree line. A figure stepped out. Tall. Dressed in black. Hood up. Face hidden. Daniel's stomach clenched. The Watcher. The same one he had seen in glimpses as a child. He forced himself to stand his ground. Who are you? Daniel called out. Why have you been following me? Silence. Then, finally, the figure spoke. You were never supposed to survive. Daniel's pulse spiked. What does that mean? The figure didn't move. You don't remember, Do you? The voice was rough, like someone who had spent years speaking in whispers. Daniel's fists tightened. I remember everything. A pause. Then tell me, how did you escape? Daniel opened his mouth. Stopped. His throat went dry. He had been in that cabin, tied to a chair. His captors had been armed, dangerous. And yet, when the SWAT team arrived, the door had already been unlocked. His ropes had already been cut. Someone had freed him. Had someone been protecting him all along? The Watcher took a slow step forward. Your father wasn't the real target. Daniel's chest tightened. That message from years ago, we were never after your father. They had wanted him. His stomach twisted. Why? The Watcher exhaled. Because you're the only one who got away. Daniel's breathing was unsteady. The only one who got away? There were others? His voice was barely above a whisper. The Watcher nodded. Dozens. Over the years. Children who disappeared. Daniel's head swam. His case had made headlines. The town had searched for weeks. But had there been other kids before him? His voice was hoarse. What happened to them? The Watcher's voice was grim. They didn't come back. Daniel's stomach dropped. He had survived something that no one else had. Why? And why had his father never told him the full truth? A thought struck him like lightning. What if I was never supposed to come home? A crack of a branch. Daniel stiffened. More movement. Not just one person. Multiple. Shadows emerging from the woods. His blood ran cold. The Watcher tensed. They're here. Daniel took a slow step back. Who? No answer. The figures moved closer, forming a loose circle around them. Dressed in black. Faces hidden. Not the police. Not ordinary people. Something else. Then, one of them spoke. Daniel. The voice sent pure terror through his veins. Because he knew that voice. He had heard it before. Years ago. Inside the cabin. One of the men who had taken him. Daniel's mind went blank. He had thought they were gone. Arrested. But they were still here. And now, they had come to finish what they started. The Watcher shifted beside him. We don't have much time. Daniel's pulse pounded. He had to get out of here. The men stepped closer. One of them raised a hand. Daniel, we just want to talk. Lies. Daniel took a deep breath. And ran. The woods blurred around him. Footsteps thundered behind. He pushed harder, breath ragged. He didn't know where he was going, just that he had to move. A hand grabbed his arm. Daniel jerked free, twisting. It was the Watcher. Trust me, he hissed. This way. Daniel didn't have a choice. They sprinted through the trees, dodging roots, branches whipping at their faces. Behind them, the pursuers weren't stopping. But suddenly, a clearing. A road. Headlights flashed in the distance. The Watcher shoved Daniel forward. Go! Now. Daniel hesitated. What about you? The Watcher's face remained hidden in shadow. I was never meant to leave. Then, he turned and ran back into the darkness. The police arrived minutes later. Daniel was breathless, shaken. He told them everything. The messages. The house that wasn't there. The men in the woods. The authorities combed the area. This time, they found them. A hidden bunker. Stacks of fake passports. Evidence of years of crimes. And files on every missing child. The men were arrested. Every single one. The Watcher had vanished, but he had led Daniel straight to the truth. The case that had haunted Daniel for years was finally closed. Months later, Daniel stood outside the courthouse. His captors had been sentenced to life. The truth was out. Justice had been served. And for the first time in years, he could breathe. His phone buzzed. A final text. From an unknown number. You were meant to survive. Daniel smiled. For the first time, he felt free. The end.